So you have been my best friend for what feels like many lifetimes.
Yeah.
And we get a chance to talk to people who are trying to get their health into a place of abundance and happiness. And one of the things that people have the hardest time talking about is how they feel about food and their own health. And I think one of the things that has happened in the last 10 years is finally all the medical models are willing to really talk about the fact that many destructive, degenerative health issues have an origin in food. And I want to talk about food. Nobody wants to talk about food. So tell me a little bit about what you've been doing in the last 30 years that has led you to realize that nutrition and what we eat and what we put in our mouths has everything to do with how healthy we feel.
Well, of course, most people nowadays are thinking that it's all about weight. And if they're not thinking it's all about weight, then they're thinking it's all about their cholesterol. So those are the two things that people show up and talk to me about on a day-to-day basis. Expecting that those are the only two places where food is really going to have an impact as far as their health is concerned. They're really surprised to find out that the stories that we've been being told by the media, by the commercials on TV, by the FDA, even sometimes by our parents, just aren't true. And it's a bit of a sacred cow in our country because we perceive ourselves to be the wealthiest, best fed, highest health, best health care in the world. And it's totally a delusion as well as an illusion that's primarily driven by the forces of money and economics. Food should be, Hippocrates said many years ago, let your food be your medicine and let your medicine be your food. So we've known for millennia that what we put in our mouth makes a huge difference in terms of our health. But we've been taught through TV and the media and so forth over the last 50 or 60 years, really since corporations got into the deal, that that's not what it's about at all. That you can have flavor, you can have taste, you can have it's all about calories and fat, and of course it's none of those things. So we really have to step back and take a look at what we're putting in our mouths, why we're putting it in our mouths, and what the ingredients are.
Well, to me that is probably the hardest issue I have to work with when I'm working with a client, is people aren't really very interested in being conscious about why they choose the food they eat, and conscious while they're eating their food. Now that's a whole other subject, is how do we approach a meal and see the food that we eat as energetically relevant to how the rest of our life goes. But for what we're talking about, the idea is that people seem to be completely divorced from understanding that what's on their plate when they put it in their mouth affects every organ in their body, affects how they think, affects their brain. You know, as you know, we've been looking at especially because the internet is so helpful in being able to research so much, is there's this push of literature that has to do with children's learning disabilities, autism, ADD, ADHD, and saying, wait, maybe a lot of these issues that we have our kids facing have to do with the food that we're feeding them. But as adults, the idea that maybe fibromyalgia or our ability to concentrate or diabetes or
depression
has anything to do with the fact that we're combining the foods that we do and we're putting them into our bodies. And so I'm finding that here I've been a psychologist for 30 years, and I'm talking now for the first time more about asking people what their nutritional life is like than I'm asking about their childhood history.
Well, of course, most people have no relationship to nutrition. That's something that you would study in college. It would be a specialty. And if you were sick, then you would perhaps go to a nutritionist and find out about that. Actually, most people want to go to a dietitian in order to find out about that. But most of what we eat and call food is not really food. It would not be recognized as food 100 years ago, because it has been altered in such a way that it has very little relationship with something that's actually nutritious.
So give me like the top 10. What are those things that we have no clue is really not true food, but has been genetically modified or altered, and we just keep consuming it?
Well, my favorite saying with my clients is, if it comes out of any package other than the one that nature put it in, don't eat it, because it's not food. So we're talking, boxed pizza. We're talking anything that you heat up in the microwave in a minute and a half or 2 minutes. Packages of frozen macaroni and cheese. Anything, of course, that has high fructose corn syrup in it. Most anything that has more than 4 or 5 ingredients in it. It's not food. It's a bunch of chemicals mixed together, packaged, flavored in such a way as to tweak our taste buds and addict our brains to those flavors, because there are actually substances in this stuff that is called food that actually lights the pleasure centers of our brain up and have nothing to do with nutrition, but has to do with chemicals. And those chemicals, we might as well be doing cocaine, or we might as well be doing marijuana, because we're consuming things that light up different parts of our brain. And then we wonder why we can't get off of some of those foods when we do need to reduce our weight or get our cholesterol down or whatever. Why can't I just stop that? Well, it's because we're actually addicted to those foods.
To the substances. All right, so how do these substances that we call food, that our body doesn't recognize as something that it sees as alive and healthy, how does it create degenerative illness?
Well, you said the words. Our body doesn't recognize it as food. And yet our body then has to do something with it. And most times, our bodies are unable to get rid of all of the byproducts of the process of digesting this food. We treat the FDA food pyramid these days as if it were something akin to the Bible, the food Bible. And yet, at the base of that food pyramid are 5 servings of grains. Now, I'm about to say something that will sound like heresy, but if we think scientifically about a grain or a seed, nature intends for that seed to be consumed by a bird or an animal, and the animal is supposed to go someplace else and poop that seed out, and then it's supposed to grow. Well, in order to do that, nature has to protect that seed with its own pesticides, its own method of making that seed indigestible. And then, and only then, can it become a plant someplace else. And that's what nature's whole idea is, to populate the planet with this particular seed or that particular seed. So when we consume those grains, our digestive tract is responding to those same pesticides, these natural protectants. It's not even the artificial pesticides that we use on the grains. It's a natural pesticide it makes this grain undigestible to us.
Okay, so, see, this is the piece that I think, because understanding food has changed my life. And so what happens really when the body doesn't what is the mechanism that occurs when the body goes, I don't know what that food is that you just put in me,
Right.
so here's my response.
Yeah, it's an
So
immune response.
It's an immune response. So can you
Immune
explain
response.
that to me?
Absolutely. Our body is set up, our immune system is created to discern the difference between self and other. Anything that enters our body that can be broken down into tiny little packages, like vitamin A or fats or vitamin D or whatever, that can then be utilized by the body. But if it doesn't get properly digested, then the body recognizes it as other. And whenever the immune system sees something as other, it gets involved. It starts fighting. It raises temperature. It creates certain kinds of inflammatory cells, certain kinds of fighter cells. And this is where our degenerative inflammatory diseases are coming from.
Okay, so what you're telling me is that the body's natural response to a foreign substance is to do what it does the best, which is to create an inflammatory response.
Yeah.
So you're talking to me about arthritis, you're talking to me about so many things that the big pharma people will just come in and give us a medicine to take the pain away from the fibromyalgia or the arthritis or whatever. And in fact, we just keep eating the food that is keeping that inflammation going, and we basically never really get better.
Yeah, the pharmaceutical system merely gives us permission to continue doing what we're doing.
Right.
It's a bit like having a lake that is polluted. Well, if the EPA came along and looked at the lake, they would not just say to themselves, oh, well, we can just throw some chemicals in that lake and clean it up. No, the EPA is wise enough to know that in order for the lake to really get cleaned up and not be polluted, they have to walk up the stream that feeds the lake in order to discover where the pollution is coming from. And then they stop that pollution, and then the lake has the capacity to heal itself, to clear itself up. So the drugs, unfortunately, are just like throwing some chemicals in the lake. Yeah, it'll get cleared for today, but tomorrow
It'll be polluted
again. And on top of it, the drugs, of course, have their own byproducts that the body has to deal with. And pretty soon now we're not only dealing with preservatives and food colorings and taste enhancers and so on and so forth from the food that we're consuming, but now we are dealing with the byproducts of the drugs. That we're
the top 3 offenders for creating inflammatory illnesses. Now I'm talking about everything from bipolar illness to diabetes. What are the top 3 offenders that anybody that's sitting there right now in their kitchen making their dinner needs to start considering regarding how they feed themselves and their family?
Sugar, number 1.
Sugar.
Anything that has high fructose corn syrup, artificial sugars, so the aspartames and the phenylketonuria things, those sorts of things, very inflammatory, and the body reads the artificial sugars as poisons.
Poisons.
Right. So sugar, number 1. Grains, wheat in particular, because American grain has been hybridized to have more of the protein in it than other grains, and we were probably never intended to eat grains in the first place. And then if we include soy in that category because it's also a
hybridized sort of
grain, then milk.
So dairy.
Yeah, and again, that's one of the sacred cows, right? That
literally the sacred cow.
Yeah, literally the sacred cow. But we are the only species on the planet that is continuing to drink milk after the age that we should be weaned, much less another species milk. So our bodies typically have a great deal of trouble with milk. However, mostly it's because of the way that you know,
Milk
not
is
mostly,
processed.
but a lot of it has to do with how those cattle are raised,
Mhm.
and the conditions in which they are held, and the fact that they're fed hormones and antibiotics in order to keep them producing high amounts of milk. And if we could return to the more natural family farm system, where we got our milk from the neighborhood farmer, where we got our butter and our cheese from the neighborhood farmer's wife, then we probably wouldn't have such a problem with dairy.
All right, so we're going to take these in little increments over time. And dairy is going to be a big thing that people are going to throw up their hands and be really not happy with, but sugar will be the number one thing. Because if you think about pizza and pasta and everything that has sugar, which is basically everything in the middle of the store that I shop in. I shop at the deli over here, and the fruits and vegetables over there, and everything in the middle, which is in boxes or cans. Usually, if you look on the back of the label, it has some sort of corn syrup or some sort of sugars in it.
Right. Or it's so processed, the grain or the other plants that once upon a time were whole have been so processed, whether it's quick cooking oats or even granola bars, pasta that turns very quickly into sugar in our bodies. We're told that we need to eat 3 to 5 servings of fruits and vegetables every day. Well, what we know now is that fructose is the basis upon which insulin resistance is developed. And so we need to eat vegetables, primarily vegetables, and maybe a piece of fruit a day or two every other day. And then lots of really good high quality proteins.
Right. Well, we could talk a lot about how does everybody get the good proteins when so many things are genetically modified or so many things are packaged in a way where that's really difficult. But for the sake of the moment, let's look at one, let's have one story. You know, because I've encountered, just like you have over time, you know, I am classically trained as a psychologist. You know, I'm looking at people who come in with learning disabilities, with bipolar issues that they think are genetic and they've inherited it from their father. People who have been really suffering with a lot of psychological illnesses, that they've tried Paxil and Zoloft and all the things that, you know, Prozac and all the stuff that's trying to mask it. And the minute I have changed a diet with somebody, it's as if they become a different person, whether it's their little kid in school or whether it's a 63-year-old man who basically has no quality of life, and all of a sudden, because he is eating properly, he's thinking better, he's sleeping better, he's lost his weight, he has no diabetic symptoms. So you and I both have a kind of plethora of examples of sort of what we call kind of miracle moments with people. Do you have one story of someone who has been against the wall where my story that I hear all the time is, I've tried everything and that's why I've come to you. I don't know what else to do. I feel like if I don't solve this, I want to kill myself. We both have lots of those examples. Is there one where you can talk about that?
A young woman came to me. She was late 20s. She was about 100 pounds overweight. She carried it very well because she was really tall. Beautiful young woman. And she was ready to check out because she was so miserable. Everything in her body hurt. Her gut and digestion in particular was terrible, but everything hurt. And she had no capacity to think a logical thought, much less maintain any sort of positive self-esteem about herself. And it was very clear to me from the get-go that gluten and gluten sensitivity was the issue. And so I just suggested to her, do this instead. Eliminate all the grains from your diet. Please start every day with protein within 30 to 40 minutes of getting up. and eliminate the sugar. Let's just start there. Be sure that every couple, 3 hours, you're having a small protein
Right.
snack. And let's see where you get to. You made an appointment in 2 weeks. She dropped 20 pounds in 2 weeks. 20 pounds. And her complexion was completely different. Her eyes were completely different. She had a spring in her step. She felt like she could actually hold down a job. She didn't want to kill herself anymore, and that was just in a couple of weeks.
Right.
It is extraordinary. And of course, she was a young woman who would have been raised on boxed pizza, Domino's takeout, Subway sandwiches, and she'd go and make all of the healthy choices. She'd have the low-fat Subway pizza sandwich, but pretty much she thought that she was doing all the right things: 5 servings of grains every day, and not a lot of sugar, but but she was also on diet sodas because, after all, she wanted to lose weight. So she now is 100 pounds lighter, and really, that's all she's done. She eats as much as she wants to. She feels like $1,000,000. Now she takes walks for miles every day. There's a great example.
So let's give one little list at the end here, because I think that I was quite shocked to know over time, after the research, after my own experiences, which I'm going to be willing to share in the future, is how changing my thinking, changing my relationship to food has completely changed my life. Not because of how I look, but because I had lots of degenerative issues based upon having eaten wheat my whole life. Let's just come up with a really quick list of all of the issues that this particular awareness could change. If people were to start being conscious of the food that they eat, what kinds of people have walked through your door? And I know it's from cancer to weight loss, it's everything in between, but what are some of the symptoms that you see as the kind of the real light bulbs that should go off in people's minds when they go, I should be starting to think about food and I'm not? Here are some of the symptoms that are classic for people with food allergies, inflammation, and so forth.
Correct. Pain is number one.
Physical pain.
Physical pain. Mental or psychological pain or angst.
So depression.
Depression, inability to think, any kind of unhealthy, abnormal thought, the inability to remember things. We're having an epidemic of Alzheimer's. And yet, when they put Alzheimer's patients on gluten-free diets,
Things change.
all kinds of symptoms just disappear. It's important to remember that all of the autoimmune diseases, not all of them, but most of the autoimmune diseases, the big ones, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, MS, are all on the same genetic allele, this strain, that celiac disease or gluten sensitivity shows up on. So there's a huge finger pointing. That
correlation.
A very huge correlation between gluten consumption and autoimmune diseases.
I mean, I have to say, I'm really wanting to slowly say MS, which is an epidemic issue, can have everything to do with chronic inflammation that is triggered by the food that we eat.
Absolutely.
And that is such a revolutionary idea.
And even if MS turns out, and we don't know what the causative agent is, we've gone the full gamut from bacterial infections to viral infections. Even if it turns out to have been caused by a viral infection or a bacterial infection, anything that degrades the immune system, that stresses the immune system is supposed to handle. We're supposed to be able to handle any virus that comes our way, any bacteria that comes away, any parasite that comes away. our bodies are amazing, and our immune systems are incredible, and we should be able to fight off and handle anything. So when we don't, when we're not, and now we have an epidemic of immune illnesses, when we're not able to, our body is not able to restore itself, then it tells us that something at the very foundation is wrong. And what's more at foundation than the food that we eat? So any degenerative disease, any inflammatory disease, most mental illnesses will respond to dietary change.